Let's make a quilt with Mama B. 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 Let's make a quilt with Mama B.
Hello quilters, and welcome back to Let's Make a Quilt Together. And this is lesson 5 and our final lesson for this particular quilt. And I'm lucky enough to be wearing a shirt that my daughter gave me that has our title on it, Let's Make a Quilt Together. And if you're interested, just let me know and we can get one for you. Now, in the last lesson, you quilted your quilt or you had it quilted. But I'm going to say that you quilted your quilt. And you know that you layered the backing, the batting, and the quilt top together. And once you did all of the quilting, you've got this left. So the first thing we need to do before we can put any binding on this is we have to trim all of that excess batting and backing away. And that's what I'm going to do right now. Now I tend to use my scissors. I know that there are quilters out there who are skilled enough with their rotary cutters and rulers to use that. But I'm not that kind of skilled, and I don't want to take a chance on cutting this quilt after I have spent so much time, effort, and money in creating it. And so since I know my limitations, I'm going to use scissors to get this job done. And the job has to be done because we cannot put a binding on our quilt until we have gotten rid of all of that excess batting and backing fabric. And that's what I'm all about right now. And so if this were a bigger quilt, I would still use my scissors. I always use my scissors to trim when I make quilts. Doesn't matter the size, even though this is a little one. I'm not going to use the rotary cutter and the ruler because I'm just not that skilled. And knowing me, I would cut part of my quilt and would be very upset with me. So the best thing to do is to trim it the way that's comfortable for me to trim it. And you can notice already how quilting and trimming already make your quilt top look spectacular. It's just amazing how a quilt comes alive once you've put the quilting on it. Just simply amazing. And here's this darling little quilt, probably color Rhapsody 3. I've made several of these little quilts during this time. And now it's ready for three things to finish it. It's ready for a sleeve, it's ready for its binding, and it's ready for a label. So the first thing we want to do is get a sleeve on it. Now you look at your quilt and you'd make the decision as to what is the top and what is the bottom. No one else can make that decision for you. You look at it, look it over carefully, and you make a decision. I'm going to choose this as my top. And since this is the top, that's where the sleeve will be placed. Now, some of you are thinking, I don't need a sleeve on my quilt, I'm not going to hang it. Well, if that's your choice, that's fine. I put a sleeve on the back of all of my quilts because I am always thinking, when will it be hung? So I would encourage you to begin to do that. You just never know when you're going to have a reason to hang your quilt. And the last thing you want to happen is for somebody to put thumbtacks or stick pins, or worst of all, staples through your quilt in order to hang it. So it's just safer to have a sleeve. And when we make the sleeve is a piece of fabric that is 8 inches wide, and I folded it, and that's why you cut it 8 inches because you want a 4-inch sleeve, 4 inches in width. And the length of the sleeve varies because the length should be 2 inches, 4 inches less than the width of the quilt. And I'll say that again. The length of the sleeve should be 4 inches smaller than the width of your quilt. That's so that when we put it on, we have some space here where we don't see the rod that's holding the quilt up. And once you have made that, once you've cut it, the first thing you want to do is press the edge in on each end of the sleeve, fold it in half and press it, and now we're going to put it on the quilt. It goes on before the binding because the binding helps to hold it in place. So I'm going to my sewing machine and I'm going to put this sleeve onto my quilt. And I like to sew it on first before I sew the binding on. Even though the binding is going to hold it in place, I still like to make sure that it's where I want it to be and I don't have to worry about it shifting when I get ready to put the binding on. So let's go to the sewing machine. Now these little clips that I use are the same as using pins, and I will encourage you to pin your sleeve in place before you get to the sewing machine. Oh, one other thing I didn't do, I should have done. These little ends need to be sewn together, so I'm going to do that very quickly. That's why I had them pinned. And don't worry about the fact that the color thread doesn't match. Generally in quilting we use a very light beige or gray thread throughout the quilt. We don't always try to match colors. And no one's going to see the back of this anyway. Okay, so here we go. Let's get the sleeve onto this quilt. Now I'm going to stitch it. And then when I get the binding on, that's going to be another way of holding it so that we know the sleeve will support the weight of the quilt. And we don't have to worry about our quilt falling. And notice that I'm stitching inside of the seam line. We take a 1/4 of an inch seam, and so I want these stitches to be less than 1/4 of an inch from the edge. That way I know that this seam line is going to be encased in the seam for the binding. And the big thing with the binding is to show you how to get around corners. Okay. Now, later on when you do the rest of the handwork on the back of the quilt, you'll come back and you'll tack this down by hand. Okay, now we need to get the binding on. And here is the binding for this quilt. I've already prepared it because when you had the lesson on preparing the border for your quilt, you know that you cut it into strips across the width of the fabric. You cut enough strips to go around the perimeter of your quilt. The same thing with cutting binding. We cut strips. We sewed them with that mitered seam, and then we sewed enough that we can go around the the perimeter of our quilt. One more thing you do with the binding. This binding is cut 2.5 inches wide. You go to the ironing board once you have pressed the seam allowances and trimmed those, and you press the binding in half. That's crucial because on a quilt, the first part of a quilt that wears out, unfortunately, is the binding. And so we want to double the fabric for the binding to ensure that it doesn't wear out too quickly. And remember, our quilts are going to live longer than we are. So you want this to be there for a long time before someone has to replace it. Okay, I'm going to show you a simple way to finish the binding. And in fact, the first thing I have to do to show you that is I have to stitch a little hem in the first end of the binding. So I'll do that. And that hem is about 1/2 inch wide. Okay. Since this is the top, I'm going to start putting the binding on near the middle of the bottom. Don't ever start the binding at a corner. Don't ever start the binding at a corner. We don't ever start putting binding on a quilt at a corner. And I can't say it enough because if you start it, you're going to end up having to take it out before you get halfway through. So, this has already been stitched on the edge. Let me trim the threads. And somewhere near the middle, I'm going to put the binding on. Start putting the binding on. I'm going to leave a little tail. I don't want to start sewing right there at the end. So, leave a little tail, and this gives me the opportunity to show you how you treat each corner. We're going to go around all 4 corners so that you will see me do the very same thing at each corner over and over again, at least 4 times, and so that it registers with you, because you're going to want beautiful corners. Okay, so I've left a little tail there, about a 5-inch tail. That's going to be fine. And remembering that this is going to be a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, here we go. And I am going to take a few stitches back to make sure my stitching stays in place. And here we come almost to the first corner. And I don't want you to think that corners can be difficult or tricky. They do require us to do maybe a couple of steps. Now, when I'm putting binding on and I'm getting close to a corner, I always put a pin at the 1/4 of an inch mark, right here. That pin tells me that's where I need to stop. So as I sew, I'm going to get here at the pin, stop, and backstitch to secure my stitches. And make sure you go slowly, you're not in a race. And I'm almost at the pin. And that's where I want to stop, so I backstitch right there at the pin. Cut the threads. Now, we're going to miter this corner. Mitering the corner means folding the binding back. And I want you to notice 2 things are happening right here if you folded it correctly. And you can even finger press that. You have a right angle here. Notice that the binding makes a right angle on itself. And you have a 45-degree angle here at the fold, the bottom fold. Right angle on the side, 45-degree angle on the bottom fold. Now I'm going to fold the binding back down on itself, just like so. And if you feel more secure, you can put a pin in it. Okay, now I'm going to start stitching off of the fabric, coming right down across the binding, following the edge just like I did before. 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. And so here we go. And that's one corner, and we're going to do the same thing to all of the corners. Okay, I'm approaching the next corner. And as I get a little bit closer, I will place a pin a 1/4 of an inch from the edge so that I will know where to stop. Some people can eyeball that very easily while they're sewing. I can't. So I put a pin in place. And here's my pin, 1/4 of an inch away from the top edge. And now I'm ready to sew to that pin, stop, and take my fabric out from under the needle. Okay, let's look for our angles again. I want a right angle here, and I want a 45-degree angle there. And folks, I'm telling you, if you make yourself think right angle, 45-degree angle, you can't mess this up. And then fold the binding down on itself. Put a pin if that makes you feel better. Okay, and now we're ready to go down this side again. And that's really all there is to it. And remember, I start off the fabric a little bit. And I back stitch. And I'm ready to go down the next side until I get to the next corner. I can see that some of my pressing wasn't good, so I'm adjusting that as I go. Okay, I'm approaching the next corner. This is corner number 3. Get a pin. Okay, and remember our 2 angles. Once I stop sewing and remove the quilt from under the needle, here are angles again. I want to fold this so that there's a right angle here. And if I get a right angle there, I want a 45-degree angle here. And I have that. Let it become second nature to you. And you will always have your bindings on your quilts exactly as you want them to be. And you'll make a beautiful mitered corner. And when we turn the binding to the back, you'll see that miter so easily, which I intend to show you. And so here we go. Start a little bit off of the binding. And then we just stitch down the edge again. And you can also see why you don't start putting the binding on at the corner. You wouldn't be very happy with that. Coming to the last corner now, and so it's almost time for the pin. One-fourth of an inch away from the edge of the fabric, the top edge of the fabric, and so to the pin. For our two angles, right angle and a 45-degree angle down there. If you know that you have those two angles in place, you're doing it correctly, and you're ready to pin it. Make sure it stays where you want it to stay. Don't want anything to shift after you've got it all lined up and organized. And we're coming to the bottom again, and I'll show you what to do to join the two. Okay, I've almost come to where I started. Now, I need to finish or connect these two ends of the binding. Notice that I sewed kind of far that time. I pressed that in, and I'm going to take some of this out. Seam ripper. Where is the seam ripper?
Is that it behind? The yellow?
No. It's usually here. Well, I'll snip it with my scissors. Can't believe the seam ripper is missing. Every quilter out there is laughing at me right now because seam rippers are always beside us. We never let the seam ripper get away. I can't imagine that I did that. But that's okay. Scissors will work. And this is a lesson too. Don't sew too close to the first tail that you left. You want to have some room to maneuver putting these two tails of cloth together. I know that wherever my seam ripper is, it's laughing at me. Okay. Here's what we want to do now. The easiest way to finish this is to slip this end into that end. And so I'm going to cut this tail off just about here. And I'm going to slip this tail into the first one. And this would have been a good time to have had matching thread since this is black and this light thread does show up on the black. But it will do for our purposes here. And if I get this in there, then I'm just going to fold it down and continue sewing the binding on. Another reason why you would never want to start at a corner. Okay, just that little bit of stitching left to do, and this binding will be on this quilt, on the front of the quilt. We still have to take care of it on the back of the quilt. Okay. And there we have it. Our binding has been put on the front of our quilt, and now it's time for us to fold it to the back. And you're going to do that, and I generally do that starting right where I left off with the stitching. Get all the threads cut and out of the way. And you just pull the binding to the back of your quilt, and I generally pin it all the way around. And so I want to show you what happens when you get to a corner. And this I like to tack down by hand. I use a blind stitch. Get in front of a good movie on TV, since I make big quilts, and I tack all of that down by hand. Now I'm going to just skip ahead so you can see what I do at the corner. And I have one over here that I've pinned. When I get to the corner, I turn the bottom down first, and then I turn the side over the bottom. And I have a really nice mitered corner. Once again, bring the bottom down first, and then bring the side over the bottom as you're turning. We can put a pin in there. And you have that mitered corner that you sewed when you were putting the binding on. Now, this one I'm going to put aside because I have one that is pinned. And so that you can see the pinning, I've pinned the sleeve, the bottom end of the sleeve that has to be handled by hand. And I've pinned all the way around the binding except one little part. And so that you can see what the binding looks like on the front side. There are many quilters who like to stitch in the ditch to catch the binding on the other side. I don't tend to do that, and I think I don't do it because I don't think I can do it well. So all of my quilts, I hand stitch the binding on the back of the quilt. And I'm going to show you some bindings in a minute where you can see that. But right down here, I haven't completed putting the binding on because I want to show you a second way to finish getting it on, which will allow you to have that mitered seam allowance so that no one can really see where your binding begins or ends. I need to turn it this way so it's facing me. This is where I started stitching. The binding has come all the way around to here, and this is what's left over. And so now I need to join these two. So I'm going to take, put this up. I'm going to take this binding that I just finished sewing, and I'm going to fold it, take it up to where the first binding ends, and fold it back. Now I need to know how much tail I'm going to leave here that will allow me to sew this together. I know that I cut my binding 2.5 inches wide. So I need to cut from this fold back here 2.5 inches. And I can do that looking right here on my board. Okay. And so we've got 1, 2, 2.5, and I need to cut right there. And before I let it move, I'm going to put a pin where I need to cut. Okay, now I'm going to open this out because I want right sides together. And I open this out. You remember how we put these strips together in the first place by making that mitered seam. And since this is a little bit difficult sometimes to hang on to, I use a lot of pins down here to hold everything together. But I'm going to stitch this the same way you stitched putting your strips together, from this upper left-hand corner to the lower right-hand corner, and it will nestle right in, and I'll be able to finish putting the binding on. So let's go back to the sewing machine and get that stitched. Okay, upper left-hand corner right here is black, so it's kind of hard to see it, but that's where I'm going to start stitching, just like you did and just like I did when we put the strips together. And you will remember we were stitching down toward this little corner right here, this little right-hand corner. And it's the same thing now, stitching toward the right-hand corner. Didn't leave myself a lot of room, but it will still work. And I'm still looking at that corner because that's where I want the stitching to end. Okay. And here we go. Take the pins out. And you can see, all I need to do now is trim that seam allowance out of there. And here is your binding ready for me to finish stitching it onto the quilt. And I'm going to do that right now. And see how it just fits right in so nicely. I just love that way of finishing the binding. And if you didn't quite get that, just rewind the film and watch me do it as many times as you need, and then you try it. And maybe if you don't try it on your quilt the first time, try it on a little scrap piece of, make a little scrap quilt. Scrap batting, scrap binding, scrap top. And here we go. It just fits right in. And no one knows where you started or where you stopped putting your binding on, because the seam is exactly like all of the other seams in your binding. We've got a lot of straight threads here. And there it is. It's all nestled in, and I'm ready now to finish pinning the binding on and ultimately to sit down and stitch it by hand. And that's how we get our binding on the front of the quilt, and I stitch to get it on to the back of the quilt. Once I finish stitching the binding, then I come back and I secure the sleeve. And the last thing I do is put a label on it. Now I want to show you some quilts that have bindings that are a little bit different. I don't want you to think you just have to use black to do a binding. Here's a quilt that I made some time ago. These are pieces of the fabrics that are used in the quilt. I just sewed those together end to end, made strips, sewed them together. You can see the diagonal seam, and I used that as the binding. The one thing I will say to you, I very rarely use white as a binding, because just like the binding can be the first thing to wear out, it can also be the first thing to get dirty if the quilt is used. Here's another one. I just chose to make the binding out of the same fabric as the outer border. And so once again, I hand stitch my binding down, but there is the binding, and it really looks like it's just one border because the fabric of the border and the binding is the same fabric. Here's another one. I had pieces of the fabric that is in the quilt, and so I just sewed those together, made strips, sewed those together end to end and used those as a binding. And it's a way of bringing the quilt out to the outside. So we've done the trimming, we've done the sleeve, we've done the binding, and the very last thing you're going to do is a label. And I tend to make my labels like this. I like to design the labels on the computer using a draw program. Your label should have your name, the title of your quilt. All quilts need a name. And so this one is called Sorbet Anyone because the blocks in here really reminded me of sorbet ice cream. And then I did it as a project in a class that I taught, and I put the date that it was completed. I also like to add little pictures every now and then, and you can do that on the computer. Now, there are two things going on here to keep it on. This is iron-on. There's iron-on computer fabric, and I've used the iron-on computer fabric, print my design on it, do everything on the computer, and then once I print it out, I iron it onto my quilt, and I do like to go around the edges. Sometimes I get the label on, and I put the label where I can put it inside of the binding. And that's just another way to secure the label. I did this on the computer as well. And remember, you can put anything on the label you want. It's your design. There is no right or wrong label. The three things that you want to include is the name of your quilt. All quilts need a name. You need to make sure you have who did it, your name, and when you did it. And that's the important stuff. Then you can put other things. Now, this particular one, I love it. I just really love this because the title of the pattern is Walk in the Park. And I had this picture that is so dear to me. And I have my two little girls walking hand in hand. We weren't in a park, we were in a pumpkin patch, but I just thought the photograph needed to go on this quilt. It just cried out for this photograph. And so when I did the label, I put my picture of my little girls when they were little. Neither one is little now, but I put a picture of my little girls on the quilt so that they look like they're walking in a pumpkin park, if you will let me. But that's what you can do with your labels. You are not limited to your labels at all. But I just use this iron-on material here so that my label stays on my quilt. Even if the quilt is laundered, the label won't come off. And the very quilt that we're doing now, I call this quilt my color Rhapsody. And once again, you can see it's inside of the binding. And I have my title of my quilt, who did it, and when it was completed. I certainly hope you have been able to make this quilt without any problems. And I look forward to seeing your work if you're willing to share it with me. And I pray that this is just the beginning of many quilts that you and I will make together. Happy quilting. Bye-bye.